Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola, along with her guests, are going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, this is Nicola Brook from Broudie, Canter Solicitors, and this is episode 2 of our podcast during module 5, which is on procurement. Joining me today is Professor Naomi Fulop, who is a member of COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK, having very sadly lost her mother Christina to COVID-19 in January 2021. Professor Philip is a professor of healthcare, organisation and management at UCL, so knows a thing or two about the things we're talking about. Also joining us is Philip Dayle, who is counsel on behalf of FEMHO, and that is the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Thank you both for joining me today.
Hi, good to be here.
Great to be here.
So the first thing that I wanted to touch on was PPE MedPro. Now, during week 1, we were told by the inquiry that PPE MedPro had made an application for core participant status in the inquiry, and that was refused on the basis that they were some 15 months out of time. And also the chair did not think that there would be any explicit criticism of them during the hearing. In week 2, however, we found out that PPE MedPro had renewed their application for CP status. Again, the chair has refused this. And all of this is available on the inquiry website for you to read. And the chair has said, so her first decision was based on no criticisms are likely to be made during the hearing. She's gone slightly further than that in this determination, stating, I do not expect it will be necessary for me to say anything that criticises the applicants in my Module 5 report. So that's not just the hearing, but also in the final report. So interestingly, Baroness Michelle Mone and Doug Barrowman have issued a statement in response to both the refusal and the fact that there's going to be a restricted hearing in week 3. And I came across this on LinkedIn, so you can read all of that. That's available on LinkedIn. So on the closed hearing, they state, this is a blatant betrayal of transparency and justice. The public will hear nothing. This is not an inquiry into the truth. It is an established cover-up. Sorry, an establishment cover-up. So clearly Michelle Mone has forgotten 2 things. One, the reason for the restricted hearing is so that the criminal investigation into her alleged actions is not prejudiced by the coverage. And 2, she's a member of the House of Lords. She's part of the establishment that she's now decrying.
So, yes, this has caused consternation, amazement, incredulity amongst our members, as you can imagine. I mean, first of all, she's redefined chutzpah by applying not once but twice to be a core participant in the inquiry. But secondly, it raises a question, and maybe Nicola, you can answer this, is how can Lady Hallett assure them that they won't be criticised either during the hearings or in her report when she hasn't heard the evidence yet?
So really interesting question. Now, the chair has been very careful in her refusal. She's not given them an assurance that they won't be criticised. She said it's unlikely. And in her more recent refusal, she has said that if she's wrong about not making criticisms in her report, and if she does end up making criticisms in her report, she will have to write to Mone and Barrowman and tell them the criticisms that are going to be made and give them the opportunity to respond to it. So it's not an assurance, it's a we don't think this is likely. But this comes back to the decision of the inquiry not to call any suppliers at all. And And she stated that this is because her inquiry is about government processes. And that's really where she's going to be able to make recommendations to improve things. And in order to find out about the processes, she only needs to hear from the government, the civil servants and the ministers who are making those decisions. But that kind of misses the point, really. And massive thanks to the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, who have published on LinkedIn their analysis of the High Court documents. They have set out essentially what PPE MedPro's case was when they were defending themselves. And they're basically saying that it was the DHSC who tried to change the packing specification, that there was no packing specification in the contract, so they couldn't have breached the contract via that route, that there was a government contractor in China who was responsible for checking the packaging and ensuring compliance, that it was the government who was responsible for storage and shipments, that the government was contractually obliged to inspect the PPE within 21 days, but did not do so, and that the PPE was not correctly stored by DHSC, and that's what led to the deterioration and loss of sterility. Now, I've got no idea whether that's right or wrong, but that's the point, that if those points are raised in the inquiry, that then means that the government has to explain whether that's right or wrong. Because at the moment, the inquiry is only hearing what the government will say about the contract. It's not hearing what the suppliers are saying about the problems involved in working with the government and what the problems were with the process. So if you're only hearing what the government tells you about the process and not what the other contractor says about the process, you're not getting the full story. So how can you make full findings about the very processes that you're supposed to be commenting on? Naomi?
Yeah, exactly. It underlines the misstep in not calling suppliers as witnesses, exactly as you say. And as COVID Broudie Families for Justice UK, our members are deeply troubled by the lack of calling suppliers as witnesses, and means this module is flawed, actually, and it's a very important module for our members. And perhaps at some stage it's very important to me personally because of what happened to my mother and many others who were directly affected by this complete abject failure of procurement of PPE.
Philip, do your members have anything to say about the PPE MedPro and just the decision not to call suppliers in general?
Well, I think we're probably a little bit agnostic on this issue, I have to say. But what I can say, as you know, a jobbing lawyer, sort of observing the way things have developed. This is probably going to end up in the administrative court as an issue of judicial review. It feels like that they are exhausting all the avenues that they have before they approach the court. So it feels that way. And secondly,
Sorry, Philip, can I just come in there? Do you mean MedPro will go for judicial review?
Yes, it feels that way.
Mhm.
It feels like all the preparatory steps are being taken. So that's one. And as you've said, the Lady Hallett is being very careful in her responses because no doubt this kind of exchange and the reasoning behind her decision is going to be what is subject to scrutiny in the administrative court if it does get there. There are criminal investigations in these matters. And as the inquiry has said, they are very keen to keep the focus on systems. Now, as to the role that suppliers can play in assisting us in understanding about what actually happened and how the system can be fixed going forward. That's a matter for debate. I mean, there are obviously are arguments both for and against, but it just feels like this is not the end of this issue.
Thanks, Philip. So moving on to the evidence during week 2, I think if we start with Michael Gove, who gave evidence on Monday. He started off by being asked about the experts report by Professor Sanchez-Grayles, and Gove was typically rude, saying the professor seems to profoundly underestimate the degree of pressure under which this and other governments were placed at the beginning of the pandemic. And I guess in response to that, Professor Sanchez-Grayles' issue was that even during times of emergency, the rules of fairness and transparency in procurement must apply. And he goes a step further and says, in fact, those rules become even more crucial in a crisis, because that's when a government is at the greatest risk of being taken advantage. That's when you will get unscrupulous people looking to take advantage of the emergency. And that's why it's even more crucial that we guard against the risks of corruption or just the risks of being taken advantage. And that point, I don't know whether that was missed by Gove or deliberately ignored. Naomi, what do you think?
I think, well, deliberately ignored, but I think his tone was interesting in that he was very bombastic, and various people have commented that he seemed rattled, which I think he was. And that's why, when you're under pressure, you come out fighting. And he, did his old playbook about we've had enough of experts, and he dissed lawyers and academics, which make of that what you will. It wasn't a very constructive way, I thought, of dealing with the evidence in terms of, the inquiry is meant to be drawing out lessons rather than slagging off international experts.
So I wasn't actually at the hearing for Gove's evidence, but I watched it just now, and it was in the fine traditions of the sort of boorish tough-mindedness that we've come to associate with Gove. He was slagging off the Good Law Project and the Good Law Professor, and he has no use for lawyers or academics, and he wasted no time in sharing those views. Listen, one of the issues, one of the issues, and it's been especially a relevant one as far as procurement is concerned, is whether we were operating in public emergency conditions, and as such, whether there was justification for the abandonment of rules. So ordinarily, or in peacetime, as they call it, public authorities, especially even in the context of procurement, they have to have regard for the public sector equality duty, which is that there must be considerations around equality before the law, and so on. We now live in a world where to raise those issues, they're considered woolly, they're DEI and whatnot. And even if you had those instincts before this this new great age, this anti-DEI age that we're in, if you had those instincts before, you would feel even more fortified in a public emergency where there can be justifiably allowances that are made to suspend some of these things. And FEMHO has been at pains with one, trying to get witnesses that we've questioned to say what their understanding was about the conditions that they were operating in. We know that there wasn't legally a public emergency, and the question is, well, even though there was obviously an urgency around procuring PPE, for example, did you think about the variability of specification and measurements, etc.? Because there are real differences between the prototypically white male, for which it seems everything which forms ground zero for everything, and whether there was properly considerations about anything else. And the witness after witness was basically saying that have been saying that they really didn't have those considerations. Gove is this strong armor of this line of thinking, and he has no he is unrepentant about the fact that if my influence could be brought to bear on pushing through something, or if because someone has access to me, they were able to get in the process, so to speak. That's fine. That's all a part of what we're supposed to do. We heard him say many times that we as politicians we push things, we push the boundaries. There is complete justification as far as he's concerned for just running with things, not observing any rules, and not being particularly concerned if there is even if there is any suggestion of sort of there's any perception of undue, I don't know, influence or any such. He's unconcerned with those things, and that's unfortunate.
Totally agree, Philip. And there's justification, and then at the same time there's no responsibility. So one of the more incredible things he said in his evidence was that he said he did not know about the VIP lane until he read about it in the media. And this is a man who was Secretary of State for the Cabinet Office. I mean, it's just it's just not believable. And then he went on, of course, where did the idea come from for the VIP lane? Oh, well, it wasn't from ministers, it came from officials. And this is another playbook we've heard again and again throughout the inquiry, actually. And then we heard again from Helen Whately, which we'll come to, but it's denying responsibility for things which absolutely ministers should take responsibility for, and it's too easy for them to blame officials.
Just to give some context to our concerns about Gove and his involvement, there's two standout examples. One is Dyson and one is David Mellor. So with James Dyson, he he responded to the ventilator challenge and put forwards a prototype. And what we see are emails sent internally between officials about Gove wanting to push for a contract for Dyson to make these ventilators. So one email, CDL, that's Gove. CDL insistent we place an order with Dyson contingent on passing MHRA approvals. They are working at full speed already. But if that's what CDL wants, later that same day, there's another email saying, please accept this as authorization to raise a purchase order for up to £100,000 in favour of Dyson for prototype ventilators. We've been instructed by CDL to proceed at pace. Another email, ensure by the end of the day, the Dyson product has first been tested and second has been approved by MHRA. So MHRA is the regulatory body. They have to approve the ventilators. And what we know is that there were issues with the ventilators that Dyson was proposing. And so all of these readers, though, Gove is the person who is doing all the pushing, not only for the contract, but also for MHRA to give approval for the ventilators. And when asked about this, Gove says he could not tell MHRA what to approve and what not to approve, and that the email saying, ensure it's been approved by MHRA by Friday, he's saying that that's shorthand. And what it actually means is we would hope that it had been tested, and if tested, satisfactorily approved by MHRA according to that timescale. So all of those words that weren't said are what he says we should read into that email. He says it's absurd that he or any other minister could instruct MHRA. And that's right, that's how it should operate. But you may recall during Module 4, there was evidence from Chris Whitty, who he repeated a number of times that he was very, very nervous about MHRA coming under pressure to approve vaccines. Now, his evidence was in the context of vaccines, but it's the same body, so why would it apply? Why would that concern be present for vaccines, but not in relation to ventilators? And then we have an email from Graham Tunbridge from MHRA saying, CDL did not appreciate the level of risk involved in the manufacture and use of ventilators, and importantly, it goes on to say, and wanted to circumvent the expedited regulatory process that has been put in place. Now, Gove says he wanted to see the process accelerated, not circumvented, but the email from MHRA clearly refers to the expedited regulatory process. So it's already been speeded up. And it says that Gove wanted to circumvent that expedited process. And Gove wasn't moving at all when he gave evidence, but the emails were clear for all to see. And I think everyone will leave with their own impression of what he actually said in person when he gave evidence and what was said in those emails. The other issue that we're concerned about with Gove is the David Mellor contract. Gove admitted David Mellor is a great personal friend, he said. Mellor also supported Gove financially in his bid to become the Conservative Party leader. And throughout his evidence, a number of emails were put to him. And again, these are emails between officials. I've just spoken with David Mellor, a good friend of Michael Gove. A second email, we know David Mellor, he has Michael Gove's ear. A third email, I've just spoken with David Mellor, a good friend of Michael Gove. The price is very high. So all of these emails specifically saying that Gove is a good friend of David Mellor. And when asked why people were doing this, Gove said they were doing that to make sure Mellor did not receive any favours. that they were trying to be transparent about the links. And again, I think you will make your own decisions about that. But the crux of it is David Mellor ended up with a contract worth £164 million, and that the price that he charged was approximately twice the going rate. But he was only named as a friend so that he did not receive favours. Naomi?
Yeah, and the really important point is that in addition to the corruption, which I believe it is corruption, and what we heard in week one was the link between corruption and inefficiency. So that corruption is bad in and of itself, and it resulted in higher cost, more unusable PPE, high proportion of unusable PPE. So in the VIP lane, we know that costs were 80% higher than outside the VIP lane, and that 25% of PPE procured through the VIP lane was unusable. So you have corruption, you have increased costs to taxpayers, and you have unusable PPE that led to deaths, including our loved ones. And this is, a triple disaster.
There's a I find fascinating the Gove performance and what it says about the relationship with rules. And there is everything about how he presented came from a position of, or from the point of view of rules slow people down or slow down performance, and just anything that can lead to a circumvention of the usual rules in relation to procurement process. Because this is an emergency. It's all about speed, and there can properly be a suspension of the usual pace, and it's okay if you're able to tap into access by association or whatnot. And it creates this this almost amoral space where he's actually expressing indignation at people who question, like, why are you not observing an arm's length approach, or worse yet, if you describe it as equality of treatment. It's just something that he doesn't appear to understand. It's quite breathtaking.
I was literally about to use that word. His arrogance was breathtaking. It's quite something to watch and behold. But moving on to Lord Feldman. So he was the former advisor to the Department of Health and Social Care. So this is quite an extraordinary story. So he was a barrister. He then took over, I think, his father's fashion business. And when the pandemic hits, he gets a call from his busy mate, Lord Bethel, who says, "Can you lend a hand?" Lord Feldman would have us believe that he was an honourable knight rushing in, rolling up his sleeves and doing what he could to help with the public emergency. So he was working as a volunteer. And he essentially says that his role was to help the team out who were considering offers. His job was to, he used this word, credentialize the offer. I'm not even sure that's a word. By saying this is being introduced by somebody that I know, and therefore their credentials are sound, and to be if they had come from a Conservative Party, he would tell people so that he was being transparent. The problem was he was doing that on some occasions, but not all. And so that brings us to SG recruitment. So Lord Feldman says that SG recruitment was introduced to him by another Lord, Lord Chadlington, and David Sumner was the person running SG recruitment. So Lord Feldman gets on the phone to David Sumner. They have a nice chat. Lord Feldman tells us that his appraisal of David Sumner was he was ex-military, ex-SAS. He'd done a lot of business in Asia. He was very connected to factories in East Asia and had what looked like an impressive team supporting him. So he sounded like someone, just from speaking to him on the phone, who sounded interesting and passed that test of being deeply connected in the Far East. He went on to say, I must admit I had a slight soft spot for someone who told me they served in the military and was ex-SAS and credentialized themselves in that way. So I probably did think he sounded like a sort of decent guy when I spoke to him. I can remember him being articulate and impressive and also into the detail. The combination of all these things meant I thought it was worth having a look at. Now, the person who introduced SG recruitment to Feldman was Lord Chadlington, as we know. Just so happens that Lord Chadlington was a director of Sumner Group Holdings, the parent company of SG Recruitment. Now, SG Recruitment does what it says at the tin. It works in recruitment. What that has to do with factories in the Far East or manufacturing PPE, I have no idea. Feldman says it didn't occur to him to ask at the time how long the company had been going, and that the fact that Lord Chadlington was part of the company, that didn't enter his consideration. He said it was disclosed, it was transparent, so someone further up the line would probably look at it, but it didn't feature in his assessment of whether it was a credible offer. And then we have emails between some of the people involved saying that they need to thank Lord Feldman because he was batting for them. And when this was put to Lord Feldman, he said, I was not batting for them. I think Lord Chadlington is possibly operating under a bit of a misapprehension about what my role was. He may have viewed me passing the offer on initially as being very helpful, but it's no different for what I've done for anybody else who I thought was credible. And that to me is just astounding. He bases his assessments, the role he's been brought on to do is to assess whether offers are credible. And his assessment is based on a chat, the fact that the guy was from ex-SAS, and he seemed to be into the detail. That's it. And the Sumner Group goes on to get contracts worth millions and millions and millions. But we're led to believe that there was nothing fishy going on. Naomi.
So yes, I think we are now referring to Lord Feldman as Lord Jolly Good Chap Feldman, because this is the basis on which he thinks it's right to put people forward to provide PPE. And his softness on someone that was ex-SAS, but who had no prior experience of purchasing medical equipment, it's like a dad's army approach to procurement, which is deeply concerning in that it was a £50 million contract that again resulted in a lot of unusable PPE, which has had to be burned. So once again, it's corruption leads to inefficiency, ineffectiveness, and deaths, which needs to be absolutely revealed to everyone, which I think it was, it has been this week.
And I think Professor Sanchez-Grales would say it's this kind of approach of assessing someone on the basis of, well, they were ex-SAS, I've got a soft spot for them, he sounded decent, so I'll pass them on to the next stage. That's what procurement rules are there to guard against. That very approach. They are there to ensure that there is proper criteria in place to assess an offer. And he was asked what briefing were you given? What criteria were you asked to apply against these offers? And he couldn't tell us what criteria was there. It was, did they have links in the Far East? And actually he said it was, do they have experience of doing this kind of thing before? Well, SG Recruitment doesn't. They've never been involved in providing PPE. Other
Well, it was
criteria.
a small company of, I think, 4 or 5 staff. It was loss making. So all those things were red flags. And the other thing that, Gove and Feldman politely are in denial about, but which is revealed in the emails. They say, oh, we're just, particularly Feldman said, I'm just a neutral person. I'm just suggesting, proposing. But they are denying that they proposing it has some power. And of course it does. And we've seen that in the emails you read out, Nicola. Of course it does. It's not like you or I proposing some supplier. This is Gove and Feldman, who was chair of the Conservative Party, proposing. And officials are naturally, humanly going to deal with that differently. And that's absolutely exposed in the emails. And to deny that is, well.
I want to go back to something that Nicola said about the reason for the procurement rules. The reason for the procurement rules is that it makes this entire process one that is governed by the rule of law, and it makes the process not an entirely political one, which is how we end up with undue influence and corruption and so on and so forth. And there is a way legally that there can be properly suspension of obligations and duties and so on. It is not clear whether we were at that point. That's one. And two, even in circumstances such as an emergency, as Professor Sanchez-Grales tells us, there still ought to be that minimum observance of equality of treatment or equality before the law and regard to processes, etc. What the instinct of the Goves of this world would like to take us, or where it would like to take us, is for a complete reliance on the fact that they were doing this thing in our best interest. They were trying to get results, and let's just run with that. We have access to networks. This is really what it was. It really wasn't about the fact that somebody might have been a donor, for example. It's about the access to networks and the fact that we were able to get things done because people were dying. That gets thrown in there all the time, and it's so important that a very strong statement comes out of this whole inquiry process around where the red lines are, and that there can't be any kind of incursion into the way these principles are applied, because as we can see, when things go haywire, they really do.
Thanks, Philip. Okay, so moving on to Helen Whately, if we may. Now, she was the former Minister of State for Care. So I know, Naomi, your mum was in receipt of domiciliary care, so this is particularly important to you. I just want to touch on some of the questioning that our barrister, Pete Weatherby, put to her. So on the 5th of April, Helen Whately sends a message to Matt Hancock, and it says, please can I have someone in the supplies team dedicated to overseeing PPE to social care? It's still all over, it's still all over the place. They've sent me contradictory info in recent days and cannot answer questions about flow. I'm also told Clipper system looks NHS focused, and again, no one can tell me whether it will cope with 20,000 social care providers ordering stock. There's only so long I can keep saying to the social care sector, we're working on it, without losing credibility. 2 days later, there is a health ministerial implementation meeting chaired by Matt Hancock. And Helen Whately gives an update on social care. And what she says is that PPE was being delivered from national stocks and care providers could contact the National Supply Distribution Response Hotline if there were any issues. There was absolutely no mention of the concerns she had raised to Matt Hancock in that text message just 2 days earlier. There's no reflection at all of the degree of concern that she had. And when this was put to her, what she said is she can't say whether she mentioned those concerns at the meeting or whether she didn't. She doesn't want to suggest that the minute is wrong, but she simply can't remember whether she mentioned it. And it's just unbelievable to anyone with an ounce of common sense that someone would have those levels of concern and not provide or share those concerns in a very meeting that's designed to bring everyone up to speed with where we're at. It just defies belief. And Pete Weatherby Casey put it to her, was this an example of DHSC saving face across government with other ministers rather than telling them what was actually going on the ground? And again, we just got the response of, well, I don't have a solid recollection of what was said. And that's it. Naomi, this must have been incredibly difficult for you to hear.
No, absolutely. And for many, very many of our members, what she did make clear was that the total lack of preparedness of PPE for social care. What also came out in her evidence was the deprioritization of social care compared to the NHS. It shouldn't be a battle, obviously, but social care was a Cinderella, as it usually is, in terms of PPE supplies. And she talked about how the distribution, in quite a lot of detail, about how the distribution mechanisms were not set up for care providers, and that's providers that run care homes and provide staff who provide care in homes to people like my mum. But what was for my particular case, what was galling was she seemed to suggest that this issue was, I mean, she obviously found it very frustrating in March, April, May, June, but she seemed to suggest it was sorted by September 2020, which it absolutely wasn't. So that in my mother's case, the fantastic care workers were themselves, of course, put at risk. And I've talked about this before. In March and April, they had no masks at all. And from the beginning of May, in the first week of May, my mother was sent 21 masks for that week to give one carer a new mask each time they came through the door. And at the end of that first week, she was written to by her care agency to say that policy had changed and that they were now going to have 1 mask per shift. So for 8 hours, they would wear the same, and it's that thin medical mask, that blue thin medical mask. They go from frail elderly person to frail elderly person, washing them and so on. And so you can imagine the state of that mask by the end of, or even by the middle of the shift, let alone by the end of it. So, and that continued. And by the way, I phoned the care agency at that point, her care agency, to ask why this was. And they said it was a change in guidance from Public Health England. And it was clearly to do with the shortage of PPE. Had there been enough sufficient PPE, they could have had proper masks and 1 per visit to a person, and the same in care homes, they would have had proper masks. But this continued past September, October, November, December 2020 into January 21 and further. So it was not sorted. And once again, it speaks to the complete failure and the result, relying on the jolly good chap version of trying to sort PPE procurement, plus corrupt practices, which left the care workers who looked after my mum vulnerable, and their families, and my mother, and all the other people they cared for. So that's why this module is personal to me, in that I believe it led. No one else was visiting my mother at that time because we couldn't, because of lockdown, and we were trying to protect her. So it's undoubted that she unfortunately contracted from a COVID from a carer, completely not their fault, of course. So yeah, it was hard to hear this this evidence. On the other hand, it's good to have it laid out like this.
Thank you, Naomi, for sharing your own story there. And that just underlines another decision from the inquiry that we strongly disagree with, and that was that Module 5 is a process module or a system module, not an impact module, and therefore they've decided not to call any bereaved to give evidence or any impact witnesses. And I think your story illustrates the very real impact of decisions that were being made by central government about procurement, and yet unless people listen to this podcast, they're not going to know that. Speaking of another decision by the inquiry, Philip, you were able to question Helen Whately in week 2. And it's particularly important that you did so because the inquiry has decided not to give FEMHO core participant status in Module 6, which is the care sector. And that just seems incredulous given how many care workers are from a Black or ethnic minority background. For you to be excluded from that module is astounding. So I wonder if you could just comment on that maybe, and also your questioning of Helen Whately.
Oh, absolutely. And Nicola, after these comments, I'm gonna call on you to send a supporting I don't know, send us join in our application or a reapplication if one is forthcoming. But yes, we haven't been given core participant status in for module 6, which is the one that will be looking at social care. The social care sector. Look, the way we talk about it is that there is this very artificial distinction between the healthcare system and social care. We don't know, for many of our members, they can't draw that bright line because you don't know where the healthcare system ends and social care begins. Many of them who are on the proverbial front line, they work in the NHS, but they sometimes double or moonlight as in nursing homes, or they may work as they may operate as unpaid carers for loved ones, and to in to that to when you paint that picture, you wonder about how they could possibly be excluded from a discussion around social care that's going to be focused on community organizations and so on. Just picking up on what Naomi said, what I did get from Mrs. Waitley, and I did ask her questions, was a deep sense of frustration about the deprioritization of care issues. So one of the questions I asked her was, what accounts for government's failure to anticipate procurement needs outside the NHS? And she accepted my question as I asked it, and there was no quibbling about government failure, and she described it as a gap. And she said that it speaks to the lack of preparation, really, or pre-planning. And I was somewhat surprised at just how candid she was prepared to be on this issue. And I think, it spoke to her frustration. Not so much though on questions around PPE and the anticipation, or the anticipation or the foreseeability of issues, issues of PPE concerning Black and ethnic minority workers. It's clear that this is not something that she had given much thought to. And that is consistent. She's not the only one. She was asked a bunch of questions about data and the fact that in a system where in a system where there was very poor data capture to begin with, there wasn't even consideration about including race and ethnicity within that, and how that would have affected the procurement process. She, like many before her, hadn't really begun to think about it in terms of equality and in terms of diversity, because the truth is that the real life consequences of that comes with variability based on ethnicity is not fully appreciated. And it's only when it becomes clear that, there are different technical specifications that sometimes arise based on this kind of difference. It's only when confronted with that kind of knowledge that these people who are the policymakers have that sort of aha moment where they, okay, fine. So it's not just a DEI or some kind of political correctness. There is actually a real life implication around observing these differences.
Thanks, Philip. Naomi?
So yeah, first I wanted to reiterate Nicola's consternation about FEMHO being excluded as core participants from Module 6 on the care sector. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I would have thought that's blatant discrimination. We know that, well, we don't fully know because the data aren't there, but we do know that a goodly proportion of care workers come from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. And just personally speaking, my mother's carers came from very diverse backgrounds. And actually, that was one of the things she really liked in terms of chatting to them. So yes, I mean, I hope we could support any reapplication you might make. But secondly, on your questioning, Philip, which I watched of Helen Whately, I thought it was really important that you brought out that point that I thought her evidence laid bare the fragmentation of social care and the failed market system that we have, which is one of the kind of bigger recommendations that we want to see come out of the inquiry in terms of, we need a national care service which is properly funded and where care workers are properly paid on the same terms and conditions as NHS workers. And although that sounds a kind of something big and grand outside the inquiry's remit, it absolutely isn't, because these issues that we see again and again coming out about social care need to be addressed, and social care, as well as obviously the NHS, need to be resilient for the next pandemic, and so reform is urgent.
Thank you, Naomi. Finally, I just want to touch on the final witness in week 2. I hope I pronounce her name correctly, but she was Dr. Beverly Yanjol, and she was a commercial specialist and worked in a complex transactions team. So she was a procurement expert with some 20 years working in procurement, but uniquely she had a PhD in cell biology. So that obviously came in handy during the pandemic because she understood the technical aspects of the things she was having to buy, and she was involved in purchasing the tests. And obviously one of the challenges in purchasing tests was that they didn't exist. And so it was setting up the infrastructure for the tests to be to happen in the first place, let alone purchasing them. And she explained some of the issues behind that it's not just the test, it's, there are so many components. It's buying the reagents, the drugs that are needed, the chemicals that are needed to carry out those tests. It's that there's no good having the test if you don't have the swab. There's no point in having all of that if you don't have the lab. You can't just manufacture lab space out of nowhere. But for me, she was one of the highlights of the evidence this in week 2. She was a rare glimmer of hope. She came across as someone who was competent. More importantly, she came across as someone who was honest. She was able to admit that she didn't get things right all the time. She was able to admit that sometimes purchasing proposals were submitted where she wanted very quick turnarounds, and that didn't necessarily give the Treasury enough time to consider it as fully as they would like, and so there was pressure put on the Treasury to do things more quickly than they would have liked. But she was prepared to admit those faults, and that's a rare quality that we've seen throughout all of the modules. Philip, what did you make of her evidence?
I agree with that by and large. I also think that the kind of care that she obviously exhibited in doing her work, saving the government tons of money and so on, but also working through the technical aspects of it. I mean, you speak about her background, her very unique background in cell biology. The FEMHO is very interested in where that all of that expertise goes. So I think Professor Sanchez-Grails talks about it forming part of the market intelligence. One of the issues with the procurement process, as far as as our members are concerned, is that during that rush to acquire PPE and so on, and there was obviously a rush. There was a global rush, and in many ways it was unprecedented. The people were brought into the process who did not have that kind of expertise. There was one witness, for example, who said, look, he was up reading technical stuff in the middle of the night, and he really didn't. He was flying blind in the dark. It's very important that there is a reservoir of the kind of learning or market intelligence or whatever it is that you call what Dr. Janzal was doing, so that when there is when there's another pandemic and there is an urgency about acquisition, that there can be easy accessibility to this kind of knowledge or knowledge reserve, and that knowledge reserve thinks about equality issues, and it thinks about diversity. One of the questions that I did ask her, in fact, was the last question, was I asked her to reflect on how government ensured compliance with the public sector equality duty in procurement decisions, specifically in relation to test and trace. This is hugely important, and it prevents us from I would think would prevent us from getting back to this same place in another pandemic where there is the argument of, look, our priority or the only thing that we were thinking about is just getting masks or getting PPE and having a prototype in mind, a prototype that can be very. I think we can bet that it is going to be white male, in white male centric. That there is that reservoir of market intelligence that can address issues of variability in the acquisition of PPE or procurement of PPE.
Thanks, Philip. Naomi, I just want to come to you finally. Any final thoughts or observations on the evidence of week 2?
Well, I think it has, in addition to week 1, completely exposed in a deeper way than was already in the public domain the corruption and failures around procurement of PPE and other medical equipment. And one of the things that's very important to our members is accountability. And you mentioned Lord Chadlington, who was a director of SG recruitment, who got a £50 million contract through contacts with Lord Feldman. And Lord Chadlington was investigated by the Commissioner for Standards in the House of Lords twice, and twice he was cleared of any breaches of the House of Lords Code of Conduct. However, with evidence that has come out in these first 2 weeks of this module on procurement, we believe this should be re-looked into. And we have, as COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK, we have filed a complaint to the House of Lords Commissioner for Standards to request that they reopen their investigation into Lord Chadlington. And And we do that because we believe that accountability is extremely important, and that by having accountability means that there's much more likely that lessons are going to be learned for the future, and we do not have this approach to procurement in the future, well, not just in the future pandemic, but now. Yes, so that our members have been informed, just been informed of that today.
Thanks, Naomi. And please do come back onto the podcast and give us an update on how that's progressing, because I think that's really important.
Happy to do that.
Well, thank you, Naomi and Philip, for joining me today on the podcast and sharing your thoughts on the evidence in week 2. We obviously have week 3 coming up, which includes the restricted hearing. We won't be able to talk about that on the next podcast, but once those restrictions are lifted, we may be able to come back and have a chat about that. But thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Nicola and Philip.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.